Well, thanks everybody for joining us. So I am really excited today to have our presenter join us. We've got Rana Zakaria joining us. She is coming to us. She is with the Community Coalition Against Human Trafficking, and she has a bachelor's in human services with a minor in social work and a master's in public health and a concentration in community health from ETSU. She's been with the coalition for 2.5 years as a community educator, helping spread awareness about human trafficking here in East Tennessee. And she just said they've trained like already 3,300 people this year, so a pretty impressive amount of training. So she's very knowledgeable about this topic. I'm really excited to hear what she has to say. She's passionate about helping others and knows that action can be created for compassion by collaborating and empowering one another. So I hope you'll all join me in welcoming her to talk to us today about recognizing and responding to human trafficking. Thank you so much. Look forward to the presentation.
Awesome. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Caleb. As you mentioned, my name is Rana, and I'm the community educator for the Community Coalition Against Human Trafficking. So that's a mouthful. We go by CCHT. Some people call us CCAT. We'll obviously be talking about how this is going to relate to you, how you're going to be seeing this in your field, especially working with the at-risk population of minors. No matter what, I really hope that this encourages you all to ask questions, whether it's today or emailing me. I will try to answer the questions to the best of my knowledge. I do not have that background working in field with kids, but I do work with a great team that tells me their story. So let's go ahead and get started. So before we talk about how this relates specifically to your field, I always like to kind of go over the basic definitions. So what is human trafficking? And usually when I do these trainings in person, the biggest things I hear is maybe taken, something they've seen on social media, that the infamous, stranger danger post. Someone walking out of Target or TJ Maxx. And I want to validate if this situation has happened to you or somebody that you know, you have every right to feel scared to share this information, to bring awareness. But I think it's an opportune moment to clarify what we commonly see when it comes to cases, especially minors. So this person's walking out of Target, TJ Maxx, they go to their car, they see that maybe there's a rose on their car or something tied on their car. They see a white van in the corner, right? It's a totally scary, weird situation. And they share this post how they were almost sex trafficked, or to stay away from Target because that's where sex traffickers are targeting victims. And I'm sure that some of you are nodding your head right now saying, yeah, I've seen that before. What if I told you guys that's not the most common way for a kid to be trafficked here in East Tennessee? I want to believe it's the movies, taken or these kind of posts, but in fact, it's the opposite, where traffickers target victims that they already know, that they already love, or have a relationship with. And for the overwhelming majority of the cases that we see here in East Tennessee, it actually starts at home, where that kid knows that person or trusts that person. So the main definition for human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. There's different types of human trafficking. Obviously, for our time limit, we'll be talking strictly about sex trafficking and how it relates to you guys. And I want you all to understand this is a major crime thriving. I read recently that it's believed to be the second or third largest growing crime in Tennessee. So it's not going away. This most definitely is a public health issue that we have to address. I don't want to say it's becoming worse. I think more folks are understanding what it's looking like and making that report, but it's something that is affecting generations across the nation. So let's jump into sex trafficking, the definition. You have that force, fraud, or coercion to make someone engage in a commercial sex act, right? It's not all black and white when we're talking about human trafficking. This is a very unique type of victimization. And in our work field, we have to be kind of more on our toes of what those indicators are going to look like and how to respond. I always like to kind of elaborate on the term commercial. What does commercial mean? It means profitable, right? So I'm going to get you all to interact with me on the chat box. What is considered profitable in this day and age? So in our chat box, what has value when we think of the term commercial, not TV commercial? Sex, what else? Money. What else? Drugs. anything of value. Property, something that others want and are willing to pay for? Absolutely. We have to have a broad understanding of what that term commercial could mean. It could be money. It could be drugs. It could be a job opportunity. It could be shelter. It could be clothing. So, we're not going to always see that transaction happening right then and there, which is very frustrating because we're thinking, all right, if I see sex trafficking, I see someone across the street handing $20 to have sex with somebody, that's it, bingo. That is very rarely going to happen, especially when we're talking about cases with kids. That exchange is going to be very difficult for us to detect. It's very rarely going to naturally present itself to us. So we're not going to have kids coming up to us that we're working with saying, hey, I think I'm being sexually exploited by force, fraud, or coercion. You guys as advocates have to dig. You have to ask questions. No, I did include on this slide CSEC. So CSEC is another term for what we often call child sex trafficking. Folks in the DCS are going to know that term because trafficking can sometimes imply moving. People think it requires moving from one state to another, one area to another. CSEC may be preferred, the preferred term that they use working with DCS or CPS. CSEC also encompasses the exchange of any sort of CSEM. So CSEM is oh goodness, child sexual abuse material. So that's basically porn. That's photographs, videos, live streaming, digital computer generated images. So to kind of help clarify all this, we're talking about sex trafficking for minors, anyone under the age of 18. We do not have to have proof of force, fraud, or coercion. Kids cannot consent to sex. So therefore, any sexual exploitation of a minor is considered human trafficking, right? It's much more easier for us to make that report because kids cannot consent to sex. We don't have to have that force, fraud, or coercion as long as they disclose that there was some sort of commercial sex act involved, then that is kind of our bingo right then and there. We'll be talking about the two most common forms of sex trafficking, but real briefly, familial trafficking, that's when a family member acts as the trafficker, and intimate partner trafficking, that's when a spouse or a partner is acting as a trafficker. So it's not that stranger danger that we all have in mind. These victims know their trafficker, the bad person. They're related to them, they're dating them, they're in some sort of relationship with them. So looking at risk factors, in your all's opinion, back to our chat box, looking at risk factors, anyone can be trafficked at the end of the day, right? Traffickers look at somebody's vulnerabilities. We all have vulnerabilities in this virtual room. They're not as apparent or evident as, say, a kid that's in the foster care system that has experienced some sort of traumatic stress, negligence, abuse, right? So in your all's opinion, with, I'm assuming that most of you guys are working with minors, what are the three biggest vulnerabilities that are affecting the populations that you're working with? The biggest issues that we as a state are struggling with that are affecting our marginalized populations. Head back to our chat box. Poverty. Karen's getting gold stars. She's answering first. Yes, poverty creates despair. And traffickers are going to target poor and marginalized populations to offer them some sort of false opportunity to improve their circumstances. That person in a pickle is going to take that opportunity for themselves or for their family. What else am I seeing in the chat box? Like 5 people into at the same time. Not having good family relations. Absolutely. Low self-esteem, loneliness, need for belonging, drug abuse, substance abuse. That's a big one. We've been struggling with that for a while here in Tennessee. Traffickers use substance dependency and addiction to keep control of that trafficked person. And whoever is not muted, if you could mute yourselves, I kind of get ADD and start listening to whatever you're talking about. But some traffickers are going to purposely supply that drug to that kid, get them addicted to that drug, and now they have the perfect blackmail. And we see that happening all the time here downtown on Broadway. We have a couple of partners that we're working with, and they see it all the time where they have these, I'm not sure necessarily traffickers, but maybe pimps or just drug lords, whoever, dangling drugs outside the window to, recruit to groom their victims. Let's go back to our chat box and see what else. Lack of education, authority figure, physical or mental abuse. Mental health is a big thing that we don't talk about enough in this day and age. People that have mental health issues are going to face a variety of challenges, including isolation, not understanding if someone has ill intentions and wants to harm them, not understanding how to offer consent. So people always ask us the big question, how do we end human trafficking? And it's not this easy fix. But in my personal opinion, maybe from the public health perspective, as long as we have these populations, these vulnerable populations in our community, traffickers will always find somebody to exploit. So the upstream solution is making sure that we end poverty, making sure that we help folks that are struggling with substance abuse, making sure that we make sure there's plenty of resources for individuals that might have mental health issues. That is how we end human trafficking. Let's go to the next slide. So looking at our populations that are at risk, again, I mentioned that anybody could be trafficked, but there are certain populations that we do want to keep an eye out. And you can see in the very top of the list, kids in the foster care system, group homes, those are our individuals that we kind of want to be looking out for. So traffickers know that these kids want to be loved and needed. They might not say it, but we know it. We know that sometimes it can be a rough transition, the vicious cycle going from one home of negligence and abuse to a foster home that they might not feel like they're getting the right attention. They're really upset, leading them to running away. So this is a national statistic, within 48 hours of that kid running away, 1 out of 3 will be approached by a trafficker. So traffickers know that these kids are in a very vulnerable position, and it's very easy to come in, not to kidnap them, but to build a relationship, to groom them, to figure out where those vulnerabilities are, to fill in that void. And with a previous history of physical or sexual abuse, just research shows that anyone that experiences that at a younger age is most likely to experience that as an adult. We had mentioned, again, those vulnerabilities. Our poverty is a big thing. Our homeless population has nothing. They're kind of at that rock bottom moment. Minorities, and again, the common aspect of these populations on this slide is that they're marginalized populations. Our LGBTQ community, we know these individuals, especially here in the South, are going to face a lot more barriers than any other population. And we'll kind of jump into LGBTQ youth in the next couple of slides. And anyone with a vulnerability could be exploited. So we have to figure out what are those biggest vulnerabilities that traffickers are seeing, and how do we prevent that from even happening from the get-go. And people always ask us, what about boys? Can boys be trafficked? Absolutely. We've had a slight increase. I mean, I think it goes back to more folks are understanding what trafficking is and are making those reports. But boys and young men are vulnerable to that. See some cases that or CSEC. So there's a great article. I have the source at the bottom if you all want to read more into it. But we're seeing that it's vastly underreported, and there needs much more research done looking at boys and young men. We're seeing that law enforcement do not look at boys as victims. Unfortunately, they're looking for the stereotypical girl victim. Some boys do not believe that some direct service or primary responders do not believe that boys can be pimped, and that therefore are not in need of services. But we're seeing that boys enter the sex trade in order to meet those basic needs. So money, shelter, food, drugs, clothing, transportation. Research shows that boys have higher rates of previous physical and sexual abuse and a lack of family support, leaving them very vulnerable and at risk for that high risk for exploitation, Looking at sexual orientation and gender identity, something else that we want to factor in. For many boys, there's also a strong link between meeting those basic needs and their sexual orientation or gender identity. Many boys report that they were thrown out of their house for being gay, bisexual, transgender, finding themselves on the street and just going into survival mode. Looking at the exploiter, I mean, it's interesting to read all this stuff, how a lot of these individuals, they're being exploited, their traffickers are much older individuals. I'm going to go very quickly on this tangent. The typical purchaser here in East Tennessee is what we see, the John, that's the term that they use, is a middle-aged male who is white, who is affluent most of the times or half the time, and is married and has kids. So that is our typical purchaser. That is, the demand on when we're looking at human trafficking. Age-wise, briefly, boys can enter the life at a similar or even younger age than girls, between 11 and 13 years, and girls are around 12 to 14 years. That's the average entry into trafficking. So there's much more research, and there has to be a conversation in our community that boys can be victims of trafficking. It might not be the same as how they present. It might be even more difficult because of that shame and stigma. So there's a lot needed, and we can have a conversation more about this, but I want to make sure that we have time to talk about the two most common forms of sex trafficking. So familial trafficking, that is when the family member acts as the trafficker. Now I see some familiar faces in this group. So if you've done this training, don't cheat. But for those who have not attended my training before, I want you all to guess in the chat box, who do you all think in the family is the trafficker? Who is exploiting that most of the times? The minor. So we're seeing mom, dad, mom, parent, grandparent, stepfather. So it could be any of those individuals that you are putting in the chat box, but most of the time we are seeing it is the mother, which is something very hard for us to process. And I remember when I first did this training and I was learning more about trafficking, how on earth could it be the mother? She's the nurturer, she's the protector. And that is why it's the perfect crime. No one is going to think that mom is a trafficker, right? Now, we've noticed lots of times with familial trafficking is that it's very common in rural areas. And folks, what's happening in rural areas, or what's in rural areas in general? Nothing. And I'm sorry if you live in a rural area. Yeah, that's right, Karen, nothing. If you live in a rural area, I'm sorry, but we know that those areas are very vulnerable, very isolated. So you have low income, not a lot of resources, high substance abuse happening in those areas. Neighbors are miles apart. So it's very easy for mom to do what she's doing and no one suspected. No one's going to think, man, human trafficking is a big thing happening here in rural areas. Now, what we've noticed is that when mom is the trafficker, many of the times she was trafficked when she was younger. So it's multi-generational. And when it goes from one generation to another, it becomes all very normalized. We've had a client tell us she was trafficked also as an adult, but as a minor, when she was trafficked by her mother, she remembers Sunday dinner, her grandfather coming up to her, giving her a pat on the shoulder saying, I heard that you're helping us pay for bills this month, kid. Good job. So of course, a minor is not going to acknowledge that they're being trafficked. They're not going to have a clear picture. They might acknowledge that they are being abused, but where it's been so normalized in the house, they might think that everyone else, this happens to them on Sundays as well. So again, even nationally, top 2 recruiting tactics that they're seeing is familial trafficking and intimate partner trafficking. So intimate partner trafficking, we see is, that person is dating that individual. They're married to this person. We want you to understand that there's an actual relationship there. I think most people think, oh, they probably meet this person on social media or at a party, and the next day he's selling her. And that's not, I hate saying it, but it's not business smart for a trafficker. He comes in, and I'll be using pronouns he and him as trafficker throughout this presentation. Want to clarify, anyone could be a trafficker, and I'll be using victims, she and her as the victim. Anybody could be a victim. I just want to clarify that. We see that, especially with these kids, they meet their partner, their trafficker, whoever, on social media, through a friend. I'm not going to say that social media has not contributed. It absolutely has. It's not the main issue. The main issue is that relationship that trafficker, that abuser has cultivated with this individual, with this kid. He comes in, he studies her personality. Where are those weaknesses? Where are those voids? Does she want to be seen? Does she want to be heard? Does she want protection? Does she want adventure? Does she want the newest designer handbag or iPhone or whatever it is? And that's where that trauma bond, that's where that, that really is difficult for us to break that bond. It takes time for that trafficker. They love on that person. And we see lots of times with kids are not going to admit that their partner is bad, especially if we call it out saying, hey, we notice your partner's been very just kind of controlling and dominating and whatnot. Maybe he's not the best for you. We know how kids are. They're not gonna be like, oh yeah, you're totally right. I'm gonna break up with this guy. So that kind of adds that extra layer of difficulty of breaking that bond with that trafficker. But we see that, throughout this process of grooming and that recruiting is that they will, say that this is gonna benefit the relationship. That, oh, and I've done all these things for you, and now it's your time to reciprocate it back. So it's important that we have to kind of, again, approach it looking at the the client, the survivor, and not trash talking the trafficker. And we'll go through some profiles in the next couple of slides to help make sense of this. I want to make sure that we're doing okay on time, but this is mainly what we're seeing. Majority of our cases for minors is involving sex trafficking. We've had a couple of labor trafficking cases. It is possible for labor and sex trafficking to be happening, but most of the venues we're noticing that traffickers are, or where that trafficking is happening is hotel, motel-based areas, online ads, and social media. Really quickly, looking at our LGBTQ youth, we know that these individuals are going to be facing much more barriers than a heterosexual peer. I've read in an article that a minor who identifies as LGBTQ is up to 5 times more likely to be victimized in sex trafficking than a heterosexual peer. We're seeing in this report that they were 3 to 7 times more likely to engage in survival sex to meet basic needs such as shelter, food, drugs, and toiletries. Remember, almost half of these individuals ran away because of family rejection. So they don't have that support. If they don't have that support and they don't have someone to help provide those basic needs, to go look for whoever can do that, whether they're good or bad. We know that these individuals are up to 7 times more likely to experience acts of sexual violence than their heterosexual peers. So again, here, especially here in the South, they're going to be facing much more barriers than any other of those at-risk populations. So upstream solution is loving on them, giving them that extra attention, that support that they need. So let's go through a couple of profiles to help kind of make sense. And these profiles are very, similar or familiar to what we're seeing on an everyday basis. So Sam is 9 years old and lives in an apartment with his mother. Every couple of weeks, his mom asks him to go spend the afternoon with the apartment manager, Rick. She tells Sam to be a good boy and do what Mr. Rick asks. Sam knows he's being abused, but he has no idea that his mom is getting a cut in the rent. So how was mom able to exploit Sam? What was his vulnerability? Let's go to the chat box. What was his big vulnerability that mom was able to exploit him? How was she able to exploit him? He trusts her and wants to be a good boy. Got it. His age. Yeah. Need for security. We are growing up. We listen to our parents. When they said do this, we're like, okay, sure, right? So it's very easy for mom to tell him what to do. He's not going to question. He's going to label Mr. Rick as the bad person. And you guys are not going to see this side of the story. You might hear where Sam has told, his counselor, his school counselor, that Mr. Rick is touching him. Or maybe you're going to notice some small red flags that Sam has not been showing up to school, falling asleep in class, not doing his homework. Maybe he is the stinky, the dirty kid. Maybe he's the kid that's developed behavioral issues. Those are red flags that we have to be looking out for. Again, we might have a survivor or a client that has a constellation of red flags. Something is very apparent, something is not okay. And then you might have a kid that might show one very subtle indicator. And I'll say for the rest of the training, be patient, be resilient, and foster trust. That is the case management that we do with our clients. And because if that kid does not trust you, they're not going to open up to you. They're not going to want to, retain what you're recommending for them. So it's all about building that relationship with that kid and fostering trust. We'll do another profile. Billy met Scott at a party at her friend's house. He attends a local college, is able to buy beer for her and her high school friends. They quickly begin a romance, and Scott buys her nice gifts and takes her on fancy dates. Julia is in love. Scott suggests they run away together, but before they can leave, they need to make some quick cash. So what were the vulnerabilities for Julia? How is Scott, he's going to most likely ask her to do something, maybe strip at a friend's house for some money, whatever it is. What was her vulnerability? He said he loved her and they are going to be together. Money, showing her love. Emotional connection, absolutely. He makes it seem that they are a team and she should do this for their relationship. Guys, weren't we all in that one ridiculous relationship when we were younger? And we thought, oh, this person is going to be the father or the mother of my children. That's it. We're going to be together forever. So, I mean, we have to approach it. It's typical Cinderella story. We have to approach it of, we were once young and we had that one friend or a parent say, well, this person's not good. What was our reaction? We weren't like, oh, you know what? I am going to break up with Scott. If anything, we tried to prove to them that they knew nothing about our relationship, that it was going to work. We were going to make it work just to prove them wrong. So we really have to, again, focus on Julia. Maybe ask about her relationship, how long you've been together. Does he make her happy? When you're showing that you genuinely care about her and her relationship, she's going to open up to you. Thank you all for participating in these activities. So this is our version of that, control, the power and control and domestic violence. And it's very similar to domestic violence. We're looking at how batterers and traffickers use those same tactics: isolating, threatening, physical abuse, that coercion, that control. And it's very easy for us to think, oh, this is never going to happen to us or someone that we know. But we have to understand this is much more insidious than someone just popping out of the bush saying, I'm gonna traffic you. That trafficker comes in, builds a relationship with this individual to where many times they're not going to identify or acknowledge that this is a bad relationship. There's the making amends. I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. Or he might say, I did a lot for you. Now it's your time or your turn to help me out. And we're seeing that traffickers are slowly pushing those personal boundaries. It's not that full blown, he sold her to 20 girl or 20 people in 1 week. Maybe it might be where he asked her to send a nude to him and then maybe send a video of herself dancing. And then he's like, oh, I shared it to these guys. And they said that if you do it in person, they'll pay you $600. So slowly pushing those personal boundaries. We'll do one last profile, make sure I'm good on time. Amanda's home life was unsafe due to her parents' drug abuse and neglect. Once the abuse is reported, she was removed from her home and placed in foster care. Not long after being placed in a foster home, Amanda's foster father began abusing her. She runs away from her foster home, but has to find a way to survive. So what was the vulnerability in this profile? How was she's gonna run away, go into survival mode. So what were her vulnerability? Needing a place to go, unsafe home life, unsafe foster home, absolutely. Trusting someone, yeah. Going into survival mode. And guys, taking y'all back to Maslow hierarchy of needs, that pyramid, the 5 stages of need that motivate our behavior. The biggest one at the bottom, physiological. She does not have physiological. Then there's that sense of safety, that sense of belonging, the love. She does not have any of those things. So when she has that big void in her life, that trafficker comes in, fills in that void, and then she wants to stay with that trafficker. And I know that's very hard for us to process, to believe. How do they want to stay with someone so bad? And we have to understand that, again, there's that unique, complex bond that they have. Traffickers do not have to zip tie, throw their victims in a cage, kidnap them in the parking lot. That's not business smart. And again, this is a business for them. It's much more easier and business smart for them to build a relationship with somebody, love on them for a little bit, provide whatever it is they need, shelter, safety, a sense of belonging, to where that person, that victim, wants to stay with their trafficker. So we have to understand there's much more than the whole zip tie and cage thing that we all have in mind. And people always ask us, why don't they just leave? And it's very easy for us to say that. We have to understand that they might have experienced some sort of traumatic stress in their life, and that trafficker came in at that opportune moment. Maybe they were sexually abused by somebody else, they were furloughed, there's some sort of family dysfunction going on, comes in, loves on them, builds that bond. This kid's not going to identify that they're being trafficked. And let's be honest, who wants to identify as a victim of sex trafficking in this day and age, where we have so much victim blaming? We've had situations where a girl had told her friend that she was, what had happened, that her boyfriend had basically coerced her into doing this. And her friend said that she was being stupid and that she was probably dressing a certain way. Again, that victim blaming, which led to them having this sense of hopelessness and helplessness of what's the point of asking for help? They might have been convinced to lie, that force, fraud, or coercion. Traffickers are going to put thoughts in their mind. If you say something, I'll beat you. And they'll beat them a couple of times. If you say something, I have that video of you or that picture of you, I know who all your friends are, I'll post it on social media. If you say something, I'll traffic your sister, or I will harm your family. So again, putting those thoughts in that person's mind, that they're better off keeping their mouth shut. They might feel loyal to the trafficker. I think by far that's the most challenging thing that we see, is that Stockholm syndrome. They sympathize towards their abuser. They develop positive feelings towards their abuser, and they develop negative feelings towards you guys. You are the bad people. That is what traffickers told them. You're trying to take them away from their safety, from their home. These are the most resilient kids you will ever meet. That being said, they know how to stay off of your radar, being defensive, being aggressive. Let's be honest, they're going to say what they can do to piss you off, to where you're just like, all right, I'm done. I've tried everything, and then they fall in between that gap and crack of the system. And lastly, those immediate needs to be great overwhelming to where they're just going into survival mode. They have no other options. They know that they're not in the best situation, but they're just living. So we have to understand it might be difficult for them to want to cut off those ties or break off that bond from their trafficker. So these are the basic indicators. And I want you to understand that you might have someone that shows every single indicator on this page or on this slide. You might not. I would say, please, please, please go with your gut feeling. If you're not entirely sure, give us a call. We can help you out. We have a 24-hour hotline. But most often we're seeing signs of physical abuse. So bruising, healing around various stages, the wrist, their arm, their neck. Maybe they're wearing the same attire, or they don't have little belongings. For a kid, they might be not enrolled in school or not showing up late, falling asleep in class, a chronic runaway. Again, they are going to be fearful of authority figures. That includes you guys. They might use words associated with the industry. If they're saying my daddy, my pimp, that's something we definitely want to be on the lookout for. But if they're using a term or a phrase you've never heard of, pull up Urban Dictionary and Google and look it up. You never know. As a millennial, I thought I was up to date with all these terms, but apparently not. They might not have any sort of ID on them. They cannot provide evidence of a legal guardian. So again, ask questions. We want you to ask questions in a very natural conversation. And I want you all to understand, as helpers, I know that every single one in this virtual room is a helper, right? It's very difficult for us when we want to help somebody out. We want to help out this kid and they don't want our help. You're like, come on, I'm here to help you out. We have to understand that they might have a whole bunch of barriers preventing them from coming out, from acknowledging that they're in a dangerous situation. We might be seeing one or two of those barriers. They might have 7 or 8 that we're not seeing. And one of those is enough to be silencing. But when you have 7 or 8 of these barriers, these factors compiling on top of another, it feels very overwhelming for that kid to say, what's the point? Even if he fixes one issue, I still have all these other issues. I can't trust anybody. The last person I did burned me. So helping walk them through that process is really important. Educating, normalizing, explaining why you're asking questions is really going to help foster that trust in that relationship. So let's talk about working with that client and I know that you all have heard oodles and oodles about trauma-informed care, but let's have a refresher. So we want to be conscious of our body language. When we're talking to this kid, maybe they're opening up about that trauma or that incident. I'm sure at least one person in this room has RBF. And if you don't know what RBF is, look it up on Urban Dictionary. Basically, your face, I know that you all are helpers, but maybe your face is not going to show it. Maybe your face kind of looks judgmental and angry and constipated. I'm a person that loves to incorporate humor in conversation. So, if you have to say, hey, while I'm listening to you, it might look like I'm angry or constipated. I'm all ears. I'm here. I'm with you. That's a good icebreaker, right? It's very intimidating for a kid to have a conversation with an adult that they don't know about something very intense. So keep it natural. This kid might tell you something very shocking and dark, and you might, kind of gasp, or your eyebrows might arch. They might tell you, I slept with 10 men last week. And our natural response is kind of like, oh my gosh. But they're going to interpret it as us judging them. Now, I'm not telling you to be like, oh yeah, you go girl, but I've learned that pauses and head nods will take you far in life. Maybe just saying, thank you so much for feeling comfortable enough to trust me to say those things. I appreciate it. We want to highlight their strengths and their resilience, understanding that they might have that loss of self, where everything is a lost cause. And I always give the example of whenever we, went through a really bad breakup when we were younger, we had either our parents or our friends say, oh, get over it, you'll be fine. And we never went back to that person afterwards because they never that doesn't make me feel good. I want someone to validate how I'm feeling. So I know that phrase has been imprinted in our head for a while. You'll be fine. Please don't say that. That is not validating how this person is feeling. You can say you have every right to feel upset. You know, I would be upset too. You have every right to not trust me. You know, you can be pissed off. It's totally okay. That makes me feel seen and heard. So validate how they're feeling. Recognize any sort of small step, whether it's they've been clean for a week, they, you know, passed, they got a C+ on their, you know, math test, whatever it is. Be their cheerleader. They need a cheerleader. And let us be your cheerleader. We have plenty of resources. So if you're not, you don't feel totally equipped or comfortable working with these populations, we have care coordinators for adults and for minors. We have therapists. We have therapists for adults and minors as well. So give us a call. All of our services are for free, and I can kind of elaborate about that towards the end. And throughout this whole process, again, educate them, normalize. If they are having an anxiety attack and they feel they're going crazy, tell them you're not going crazy. We actually talked about this one topic that was very sensitive for you, and that most likely upsets you, which is totally normal. So let's avoid talking about that for now and talk about something else. What do you want to talk about, right? That is how we are trauma informed, and keeping the survivor kind of centered and throughout this whole process. Other things that we want to keep in mind in the screen when we're screening, when we're addressing those basic needs, you are fostering trust. When's the last time they've ate? When's the last time they've slept? Do they want to, you know, wear something more comfortable? Maybe you notice that they have kind of their clothes have holes in it. They're not clean. What can I do to make you feel more comfortable? When you're asking these questions, you're fostering trust naturally, right? And I always use the example whenever we're having to foster trust, and we might have, I know that you guys have to document things. Everything has to be documented. I use the example when I go to the doctor's office and they ask me a yes or no question. Do you drink? Yeah, sure, occasionally. And they are looking at their laptop for 10 minutes, jotting things down. I'm like, dear God, what did I say to where you're writing 10 minutes worth of notes about this yes or no question? Like, what are you writing? Are you saying patient's alcoholic, has low self-esteem issues? Like, show, what are you saying? So if you have the space and the time to say, is it okay if I write these things down while we're talking? You're giving some of that power back that they've lost, right? Giving that autonomy. And if you have, again, that platform, that time to say, do you want to see what I wrote down to make sure that I didn't misinterpret what you were saying? Show them. That's how you foster trust. Always maintain that patience and respect for that person's history. Again, be cautious of your body language. Let them speak. Sometimes they're not going to want to speak the first time or the second time. We don't want to poke and probe for answers. Give them that space to get used to who we are and trust us as a person. So important things that we want to factor in when we are screening. And I'm going to kind of go through this briefly just because of our time limit, because we still have a whole bunch of stuff to talk about, but that source is at the bottom if you all are wanting to check that out. We want to make sure that we're looking at their age and developmental level. I mean, those levels, and we know that it can affect memory, when someone goes through trauma, comprehension, sense of time, their linguistic capability, their attention span. Looking at the effects of trauma on that memory that might shape how that kid has stored or recalled that memories. So we want to factor that in. We want to really be careful of how we ask questions. We have some screening tools that I can actually send to Caleb, and he can send you all a couple of PDFs of, you know, a false suggestion to a child can be made in many ways. Maybe you're going to ask, what happened when that man touched you? We're already assuming that incident already happened. So we have to make sure that we kind of ask that question in a way that they're going to give us the answer, not that we're automatically assuming something did or did not happen. There's growing research showing that some kids are going to need more than one interview. If that is needed, we really try to, we recommend that you use the same interviewer with that kid so that we're not re-traumatizing them. And lastly, biases. As helpers, and especially in this situation, we need to make sure that our views, looking at it from our professional and personal experiences, we kind of keep that at the door. We can't always assume something did or did not happen. And one way to help avoid bias is to kind of address a variety of hypotheses rather than confirming or negating something did not happen. Some do's and don'ts, and many of these techniques, I'm sure that you guys are already doing and utilizing when you're working with kids that have gone through the foster care system. But, you know, active listening, being empathetic, using interpreters if necessary. Don't always assume that they, you know, do not need an interpreter. You want to ask. Being non-judgmental. Those are some strategies in building that trust. So we always want to tell them it's not their fault. You might have to say it over and over and over again for them to finally accept it, because there's this shame and guilt that they have inside bottled up to where they don't feel worthy of our help. Recognize that they're not going to see themselves as a victim. And I'm not telling you that, on day one, you have to be like, hey, you're being victimized, acknowledge it, accept it. Just understand that they're not going to want that assistance in the beginning. That's something that they're going to have to slowly acknowledge later on. Building that relationship is going to take some time. Be patient, be resilient. And again, I don't have too much experience working with kids, but when I'm always asking our care coordinators, what do you all do on the first and second, appointments that you have with these kids? Like, how intimidating is it? And she's like, we talk about everything except what happened. We talk about TV shows, we color, we crochet, whatever it is to kind of help build some sort of a foundation of trust. I do. And a great way to foster trust, again, is to meeting those basic needs, those physiological needs, shelter, food, sense of security, things like that. Really hard not to, but let's not talk smack about the exploiter. That child's going to have a very complex relationship with that exploiter. So let's just focus on the survivor and let law enforcement deal with that exploiter. Understand that these kids are going to be very terrified to come out and tell you what's happening, because possibly what that trafficker has threatened them. Maybe they have that, that video, some sort of blackmail, maybe threatening to harm a family member. So they might give you a false story. I'm not telling you to call them on their BS. Understand that there is a reasoning behind that. That trafficker has conditioned them into, say, if they ask, ABC, you answer XYZ, period. So be patient, be resilient throughout this whole process. Understanding those basic needs, what we're working with at our safe house and with our kids out in our community that we serve. The first thing that we always want to assess is the physical health. Untreated injuries, STIs, STDs. Usually the first 2 weeks consist of us taking them to doctor visits to make sure that they're physically okay. Then we have behavioral health. So we want to make sure that we have some sort of therapist, particularly someone who has experience working with minors who have been exploited, doing some sort of psychological assessment on them. And it's really important that you have someone who has that experience. If not, we have a couple of resources that we can offer to help determine what works best for them. Housing, there are plenty, or I would say plenty. We have lots of group homes and foster parents that are helping with housing, but we know there's kind of a shortage right now. So again, people ask us, how do we end human trafficking? If you can be a foster parent, please, we need that, right? If you can't be a foster parent, be respite for a foster parent. There's plenty of mentor programs that are needed out there that need especially men to be those mentors for these young men. Looking at educational needs, some of these kids have not gotten their, I think it's called a high set now, not the GED high set. So connecting them to any sort of resources if they're needing some sort of non-traditional schooling option is going to be important. Looking at employment, some of these individuals, because of that history, they might not be able to get a job because they can't pass a background check. So make sure that you connect them to businesses, organizations that can help with that. Some of these kids made a lot of money in a short period of time, so they're not going to be very fond of working a minimum wage job. And let's be honest, who likes minimum wage? That might lead them going back to their trafficker. So it's really important to have some sort of mentor throughout this whole process, walking them through, empowering them. If they have a moment where they kind of feel tempted to go back, to call that person as they're kind of like in their circle, their safety plan, and other basic needs. We've had kids that you learn how to do their laundry, how to open up a bank account, keeping medical records. So these are things that we really want to emphasize, that some of these kids don't know how to do some of those basic things. So to have someone to help walk them through that process is really important. As I mentioned, we do have some screening tools that we would be more than happy to share with you guys. And we want you to use this as a template, meaning do not read this verbatim. A child's going to know. So I always recommend put this in a place that you're going to see for the next week to 2 weeks. read it, regurgitate it in a way that you're going to be asking those questions. But this does give you a good idea of things that you need to be asking for, or asking to see if this kid has been trafficked or at risk for exploitation. And I like how they're worded. They're worded in a non-judgmental way, saying sometimes people may have been involved with the police, maybe for running away, for breaking curfew, for shoplifting. There can be lots of different reasons. Have you had any problems with the police? We're not judging them if that has happened to them. We just want to make sure that we're asking those right questions. So a positive to 2 or more is considered positive for trafficking. So if that is the case and that happens, if you're not with DCS, you want to call DCS and let them know that you suspect, trafficking or a CSEC. And most likely they will call us. We work with DCS pretty often. I do trainings with a DCS pretty much every month or every other month. And I want to say 90% of our referrals for minors comes through DCS. And sometimes you have kids that do not want to answer a single question that you're asking them. Totally understandable. So we do have some personal assessments. I would say to use this on young and emerging adults. So not like a 5-year-old or, a kid that's in 7th grade. Maybe if this is like a young teenager or someone that's about to age out, this is probably a better tool for them to use. We've seen people put this like in bathroom stalls at their agencies to where this individual can view it by themselves, because sometimes their trafficker might be with them. But this really does help organize their thoughts and gives an example of, if your partner has done this is an example of isolation, or he's, threatened me. So the left side is sex trafficking. The right side is labor trafficking. We now have these both in Spanish. If that's something that you all would like, I'd be more than happy to send these as well. And again, this will be after our training. Caleb will send these out. But this is something that we have created for you guys to utilize. This is a quote with permission taken from one of our clients, and I'll read this out loud. It's like every time you do it, it eats a part of you. It eats a part of you away. And it's just like, it's unexplainable how it makes you feel. You're worthless. You're not good anymore. You're damaged goods. Like me, I never thought a man would want to touch me or actually love me. And this is the sad reality of trafficking we see with kids, that traffickers have brainwash these individuals into thinking that there is no way to escape or there's no room for improvement. And one thing that we want to prep you guys when you're working, most likely you have already worked with with kids that are at risk or have been trafficked, is that there's not this special golden book or treatment. There's not a different triage when we're working with these individuals. It's going to be a kid that has complex layers. Our expectations, our perspective have to change, because these kids are facing very unique psychological effects of that trauma. We know that trauma can change how the brain processes things, how it recalls things. It's almost gets rewired differently. So we see that loss of self, that they think that there's no hope for themselves. They can't trust anybody. They've been dehumanized over and over again. They're just there kind of functioning. When I mentioned that loss of self, as case manager or as advocates, we should be listening to this type of perspective. Do they feel hopeless about themselves, about the future, about the world? And when we hear them talk like this, we have to help them self-actualize. If you hear them say something like this, you can say, hey, I hear you saying these things, and this is actually really kind of a common result of trauma. Help normalize, help validate how they're feeling. You want to walk them through that process, and just kind of, again, when you're keeping them in that circle and you're kind of focusing on that survivor, keeping them that core, that fosters trust. So fostering trust, being patient, and being resilient is that case management that we had talked about. So let's create that safe space, meeting those physiological needs, allow them time to acclimate, whether that's for a day or a week, whatever it is. We want to keep that survivor-centered approach, looking at their strengths, asking them, is this something that you want to focus on this week? Who knows them better than themselves? Are these goals SMART goals? Are they achievable goals? What do you want to do this week? Creating that safe process, using that trauma-informed care we had talked about, and making sure that we always, ensure that cultural awareness, having that non-judgmental approach when working with these kids. So talking about the stages of change, it's, stay resilient. I know I've said it over and over again, but it's very common when working with a kid to invest in them, to build a relationship. she's making wonderful progress. She's been clean. She's not talked to her trafficker. Maybe a couple weeks later, she goes back to her trafficker or a new trafficker, or starts using a substance. And we have to acknowledge that relapse sometimes is a part of change. We don't want to necessarily celebrate relapse, but we need to be resilient and in the moment and available back at that pre-contemplation phase, because they're going to come back to you if they trust you. So if we can be present, that is the only way that we can make it all the way back down to stability. So being patient, be resilient, and know, who your resources are in the community. So recommendations, we need to make sure that everyone across the board understands what trafficking is, what it's not, especially focusing on boys and young men now that we're seeing kind of a growth in that here in East Tennessee. Make sure that we're using the right instruments and screening assessments, and we can provide that for you guys. We want to also screen if someone has, suicidal thoughts, and if they do, we don't want to judge them. I actually used to work for a hotline, and people always have a misconception of, if I ask it, am I kind of like implanting that thought in their head? You're not. You want to ask it in a non-judgmental way, of course. Do not require that client to describe, their trauma right then and there, especially if they're not ready for it. Remember, use that trauma-informed care, and making sure at the very end of your session, whether you think you've talked about something serious or not, making sure that kid feels grounded and feels safe. You might have asked a question or mentioned a name or a location that triggered them, and they're not showing it right then and there. They might have dissociated. So making sure every single time you're working with that client that they feel grounded, they feel safe, they have that safety plan, they know who they can contact if they're, having a moment where they want to use a substance again, or call their trafficker, or whatever it is. So a little bit about our agency. So we are the Community Coalition Against Human Trafficking. Grow Free Tennessee is our direct service branch. So when we're working with organizations outside that we don't want to disclose that victimization. So, because if we say that we're from a human trafficking agency, we've kind of given away that victimization of that survivor. So we use Grow Free Tennessee as that name, and that's our direct service branch. Our biggest initiative is to raise awareness about trafficking. I firmly believe that knowledge is power, and we're talking about all these gaps in the system and how all these individuals are vulnerable and all that. It all starts with the conversation. If more folks are talking about trafficking, more folks are aware about trafficking. If more people are talking about trafficking, maybe we have more survivors and victims feeling comfortable enough to come out and say, yeah, that's happened to me. Where can I get some help? So it all starts with knowledge. We have specific trainings for our primary responders, about 11 trainings right now. I do trainings with law enforcement, medical professionals, foster parents, social workers. I did a training with truck stop managers. I did a training in Sevierville. We have a lot of tourists coming in and out. We see some labor trafficking happening in those areas. And I do trainings for just folks that want to learn more about trafficking, that might not be working with trafficked individuals, but just want to learn more about it, which is fabulous. We have 2 task force that meet up once a month, one in Knox County and the other one in the Tri-Cities area, discussing challenging cases for minors. So we actually just had it today. It's called Free Knox Kids. If you're not part of it and you are in the direct service field working with kids, you can holler at me after this training and I can give you the connection to that. But we have a very diverse group. We have law enforcement, healthcare professionals, DA's office, other nonprofits, other direct service folks meeting all for the same cause, talking about kids, the challenging cases that we have, making sure that we throw traffickers and exploiters in jail for a long time. And lastly, we have 2 safe houses for adults that identify as female. We do serve all individuals, but these safe houses are strictly for female adults. One's a short-term and one's a transitional. Both receive case management, therapy, all that we can provide, loving on them in any way, empowering them. That transitional safe house kind of gives them more of that space to get back on their feet, for them to grow. I know that we're at 1 o'clock right now. I will stay after if we have any questions. I know that was a lot in an hour. These are our numbers from last year. From our personal hotline, we received 300 reports. We served 212 individuals. Almost half of those were kids. All of these numbers have gone up every single year since I've worked at the agency. It's a good and a bad thing. We want you to know that's happening here. It's happening in every single county. TBI had conducted a report. Human trafficking was reported in every single county in 2019. So rural, metropolitan, it's happening in your area. And we want you all to feel equipped and comfortable to ask for help. Numbers we'd like you to save in your phone. The top number is TBI's hotline, who again we work really closely with. Middle number is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They say that you move out of Tennessee and you're not entirely sure who's in your area to help provide those resources. You can call that number. And the bottom number is our hotline. So we take referrals over the hotline. If you have an adult that's needing assistance, they have to make the call. You could be with them, but they have to make that call. So hopefully you all can take a picture with your phone or quickly jot that down. You know, we have a social media. If you want to follow us on our social media, we post commonly asked questions, debunking myths and misconceptions. Actually, someone sent me something today, this morning on TikTok. There was a story of someone giving somebody a rose on the street and they saw white powder on it that might have had fentanyl, possibly, but that caption wrote, "I was almost sex trafficked." And of course, that video had like over 40,000 shares, and everyone thought that is how sex trafficking is happening here in the States. So, you know, we post all sorts of stuff. And I think I'm not a huge social media person, but I know that when you like and you share things, it helps with the algorithm. And when more people are sharing things, again, that's spreading awareness. So help us spread awareness about trafficking here in East Tennessee. If you want to sign up for another training, or you know somebody that would like a training, our trainings are free 99. They're grant funded, so you can do a virtual or in-person training. I'd be more than happy to help out with that. And we'll take questions if you all have questions. I don't mind staying after, Caleb, if we have any folks. I'm seeing the chat box light up.
No, I think that's great. This is such a good presentation. I really appreciate all this information and sharing all this. I encourage anybody who has a question, please, post in the chat or unmute. Either way, if anybody has a question, we can definitely stick around for a few minutes. I want to remind everybody, just in the meantime, while you're typing those questions, the link to the survey is in the chat. Please take a minute to fill out that survey link. Again, that survey is what's going to get you to your certificate for attendance today. So if you can, click that and give us your feedback and any suggestions. But does anybody have any questions? Ms. Zakaria, anybody?
And I can put my my email in the chat box.
That'd be great.
Like I said, I'll be sending you that PDF with the screening tools for folks to view. And if you all have any questions, please feel free to hit me up, and I can connect you to our Director of Youth Services, Lisa Bolton.
No, that's super helpful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us to give this presentation today. And we will make sure as soon as, when you give us the screening tools, we'll pass them out to everybody. We have everybody's email that you use to log in. We should be able to use that to send out the screening tools. I want to remind everybody, we're going to post a recording of this. If you have colleagues you want to share this with, we'll post that to our YouTube channel. It may take a week or so. We're having some internet issues, but as soon as we do, we'll get it to our YouTube channel. And I want to remind everybody that next month we'll have a presentation by Dr. Caitlin Williams, our postdoctoral fellow here at the COE. She's going to be presenting to everybody on trauma-informed care for LGBTQ youth in foster care, which I think is going to be another excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Rena, for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.